Salams, you're watching Daily Debrief coming to you from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani, and on the show today we're talking about the latest from the G7 summit in Germany, protests in Ecuador that have entered their second week, and Wimbledon starts off under a cloud of controversy. First up, the Ukrainian president has met G7 leaders via video conference as a summit of the most industrialized nations, including Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, the United States, and of course, the European Union, focused on two key agenda points, the war in Ukraine and countering China's Belt and Road Initiative. Apart from Zelensky, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, whose country is hosting the summit, has also invited India, Argentina, Indonesia, Senegal, and South Africa as partner countries. The Ukrainian president, whose video conference wasn't made public, addressed these leaders on the 27th of June. In the context of Ukraine, the air defense system is one of many pledges of military support, including artillery ammunition, as leaders are committing long-term support for the government there, including discussions on further help for Kiev and more sanctions against Russia. Abdul is in studio to discuss the implications of these meetings and what is likely to proceed. Abdul, with regards to the missile defense system that the US has kind of announced it is purchasing on behalf of Ukraine, we don't know when this will be deployed, what the training period will be, what kind of missiles will go with it. Also, further military aid is sort of expected to be announced either now or at the following NATO summit. So in this context, it seems like a bit of a strange way to be suing for peace.
Well, I don't think G7 or the Western countries as a whole are interested in peace at all. If you see what is happening since February, they have been consistently trying to scuttle the talks, the negotiations possible. First, they denied Russian concerns, provoked in a way, to some extent, Russia's actions in Ukraine. Then all the talks which were happening in Turkey and other places, they basically discouraged Ukraine to participate in. Instead of encouraging Ukrainians to participate, what they are doing is basically promising on each and every occasion possible more weapons and more weapons. For example, you just mentioned NATO. The NATO summit is going to happen in 2 days, which is, if you strategically ask, is much more convenient platform for announcing such kind of defense deals or defense support. G7 is primarily for the economic concerns. Instead, they use this platform also to pursue the similar agenda. It shows the desperation of the Western countries to basically to sustain the war in Ukraine, because they think this is the opportunity to settle the score vis-a-vis Russia, and to basically, to some extent, gain some kind of economic advantage vis-a-vis China as well. That there is no other explanation for the things which are happening at this moment in G7 meetings. Because as you will see, how China and Russia are at the focus of this thing. The announcements of the deal, and which have been made, announcement of the weapon supply, which have been made earlier also, as you rightly pointed out, and Ukraine had complained time and again that none of those announcements are materializing on the ground. But they want to maintain the optics. That optics becomes important. So that basically a strange way of fighting a kind of proxy war in Ukraine. And G7's meeting basically confirms it. The Russian claim and other, basically the strategists who are trying to understand what is happening, they have claimed that this is a proxy war, and G7's move to basically announce purchasing of missiles and placing more weapons instead of trying to pursue Ukrainians for talks is basically confirms the idea that it is basically a proxy war going on in Ukraine.
And it's interesting that it's a missile defense system that is at the center of this, because the US's own reports have sort of questioned the efficacy of those systems, and countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel, who are using very similar systems, have also, I mean, we've seen the Houthi strikes.
That is one thing quite common in the Western announcements of aid to Ukraine.
Ukraine.
Most of the weapons systems they are pledging to Ukraine are either faulty, have been not tested completely, and so on and so forth. So that's what I say. This is a strange, way of fighting a war in Ukraine.
Moving on to the investment part of things, they've also announced the Partnership for Global Investment in Infrastructure, which is a $600 billion plan. In the context of the Belt and Road Initiative that we kind of mentioned, does this sort of symbolize the Bretton Woods system's desperation for survival at this point?
Of course, there is no other way to explain it. The Belt and Road Initiative launched way back in early 2010, is $1 trillion project. This is 600, and that too divided into the richest countries and the groupings in the world.
Yeah.
They are not pledging more than US, the biggest economy in the earth, is pledging $200 billion. And European Union is pledging more than the US. It shows that there is no consensus within the grouping about how do they want to proceed while tackling the economic challenges coming from China. And that this basically, if you see Bretton Woods institutions have seen massive erosion of their legitimacy in last 3 decades, primarily because it has failed completely to deliver on the basic promises of global development. What we have seen instead, that rising of inequalities, the third world countries are forced to take loans and default, and they are basically burdened with unnecessary interest and other things. So the Bretton Woods institutions, the role of Bretton Woods institutions as a promoter of imperialist interest has become quite obvious for the third world countries, and Chinese efforts are basically putting further question mark on their existence and their legitimacy. So this is a desperate move to save it. If you just see one data, it will make it clear that how this is not only a desperate but also a dishonest pledge. The richest countries on the globe, G7, has only 0.37% of their gross national income pledged for development support all across the world.
Right.
So far. They had, according to their own pledges earlier, they had basically said that they will spend at least 0.7% of their GNI for development as a development aid for the countries. Even that is half. With this additional pledge, even if we include that, that does not increases that portion of their commitments in any substantial way.
Percentage. Right. And also, like I think President Biden said also, this is neither aid nor charity. So
exactly.
It pretty much sums up.
So it seems very indecisive, confused state in which the G7 also meet. The meeting is also happening at this moment.
All right. Thanks for the update, Abdul. And I think after the NATO summit, we'll have some more updates and we'll call on you for those. But we're moving on now to Ecuador, where the President Guillermo Lasso has made some steps towards easing the violent state crackdown on protests in the country, lifting a state of emergency imposed in 6 provinces amid mass protests by indigenous groups. Meanwhile, legislators are hearing an opposition motion to remove Lasso from office. Emergency laws were eased after the first round of official talks between government officials and Ecuador's largest indigenous organization, which began the protest 2 weeks ago, demanding lower fuel prices, regulation of prices of agricultural commodities, and increased public education on spending. Zoe Alexandra has been covering the protest that began on June 13th and spoke to me earlier. Zoe, good to have you on Daily Debrief. First up, what's been happening over the past 14 days of these mass protests in Ecuador?
Well, it's a quite interesting situation in Ecuador. For the last 14 days, indigenous organizations, peasant organizations, trade unions have been on the streets demanding that the Lasso government listen to 10 basic demands that they have for the government, a lot of them regarding the prices of fuel, of food, and other things that affect the daily lives of working class communities across the country. They've been on the streets. CONAI, the Confederation of Indigenous Federations of Ecuador, one of the largest indigenous organizations in the country, has been leading these protests. In the first day of the national strike, the leader, the president of CONAI, was arrested. It was, extremely rejected, this horrible act of repression, but the repression hasn't stopped there, and it's actually intensified. So over these 14 days, 2 weeks of national strike, over 127 people have been arrested. There are over 145 injured. 5 people have been killed due to the heavy police repression, and there are 8 disappeared people. So it's a very, very grave situation. People across the continent, across Latin America, have raised their voices in solidarity with the Ecuadorian people once again who are on the streets. These are very similar demands that we saw in October 2019, when indigenous, peasant, and students were on the streets of Ecuador demanding an end to the neoliberal reforms that the government of then President Lenin Moreno was raising, allegedly, following the diktats of the IMF, which he had signed agreement with. And so these are some of the very same demands that have brought people on the streets again. And once again, the government does not have a solution that will really satisfy the needs and the demands of the people. It refuses to stop the repression. It refuses to take their demands seriously. And at the end of the day, what the people are demanding is a change in the system, is a change in the policies that put the economy before the people and do not listen and close all roads of dialogues with the people on the streets. And so there has been the government of Guillermo Lasso has made some small attempts and made some concessions, but the movements on the streets have considered that these are not enough, and they're going to stay on the streets to continue pushing for these demands.
Right. And the opposition in Ecuador also mounting some pressure. So legislative front, is that kind of factoring in, adding to sort of the weight of the mass protests on the street?
Definitely. So one of the largest legislative groups, which is the Union for Hope, which is the continuation of Rafael Correa's kind of parliamentarian bloc. Of course, his party was banned. And so they have actually brought an impeachment motion forward. They're seeing the discontent of the people on the streets. They're very close to many of the movements that are mobilizing. And they're saying if this government is incapable of responding to the demands of the people, is only responding with repression, is violating the Constitution, is violating the basic rights of the people, then he should no longer be fit to rule. And they're calling for his destitution. It's unclear really how this will play out in the parliamentary sphere. They don't have the majority that they need for this to go forward. However, it's still going on. This debate is continuing, and this is definitely adding more pressure to the government. It's adding more pressure supporting the people on the streets. So it's quite an interesting development, and the debate is continuing today, and we'll definitely see how this plays out over the upcoming week.
Yeah, and we'll come back to you for more updates as and when it does. Zoe, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
And finally, tennis's most celebrated championships, Wimbledon, got underway today at the very uppity All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club in southwest London. The lineup is being headlined by a group of aging stars led by Serena Williams, Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic, and even Andy Murray. You might have heard that the tournament decided to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes, including world number 1 Daniil Medvedev and number 8 Andrei Rublev. The tournament will not carry any ranking points this year because both the men and women's professional tours are firmly opposed to bans on individual athletes. Players themselves, including Novak Djokovic, have also opposed the ban. I spoke earlier to Sharda Ugra, a senior sports writer, for more on what's happening at Wimbledon.
Yeah, Siddhant, excuse my absolutely transformed voice, but I am looking forward to finally, hopefully, in the men's draw, seeing a new champion. What everyone says, and I think by what the bookies and the odds makers are saying, look, it'll be very tough to stop Djokovic from winning his 4th straight title. He's won 3 Wimbledons in a row. He's been 21 matches unbeaten. So it's going to be very tough, but you can, what's wrong about hoping? So we can always hope that some young gun or next gen actually comes through. In the women's section, there's always variety. There's always something new to look forward to. Whether Iga Swiatek can push through, it'll be lovely to see her play on grass. She's such a fun player to watch, and to see whether she'll be able to get over her previous hurdles of playing on grass, and whether Serena Williams has it in her for title number 24. That looks very, very unlikely. But there's Serena, and somebody asked her what will be your best outcome, and she just did an eye roll and says, please. That was too classy.
Leave me alone.
Leave me alone. Stop it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so it should be interesting. Well, I guess there's a lot of focus on the older generation, and so much of sort of media space has been taken up by that generation that, outside of the majors, we don't hear that much of the next generation. So yeah, I think that's something we're all looking forward to. But one of the sort of wider issues, Sharda, that's come up this time with Wimbledon is, of course, the stance they've taken to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes, as we spoke about before as well. When sort of prime tournaments and events like this take these kind of measures, it sets up some kind of legitimacy or a precedent for others to act. And we've talked also about the kind of opposition there is to this ban. As someone who has covered world sport for several years, how do you view this kind of sanctions regime impacting the future of individual athletes and in what is essentially an individual sport that has nothing to do with, the country or steps political leaders might take?
It's interesting, that Wimbledon did this, and it was almost watching how the ATP and WTA responded to it was also quite revealing, because they said, this is it. You cannot mess with our players anymore. We have taken rankings of your tournament and we don't care. Now, fundamentally, it won't make a difference because everyone will come to Wimbledon. We are all emotionally attached to it and all the rest that's there with it. But it's important for us, for individual sports, and maybe even for team sports. I mean, the thing is, Russian teams are banned from playing in tournaments. Clubs are banned. Basically, it's not their fault what's being done by their political, heads of state and so on. So I think in team sport, I think we have lost the space to, I think teams and clubs and countries, their sporting entities have lost that kind of space, because for them, they are automatically seen as symbols of or engines of nationalism and carrying forward national pride and all the rest of it. But for individual athletes, I think it's important for them to stand their ground, and tennis has done that by showing how tennis has shown how that can be done in various, particularly, and they've also sent a message out to the other big majors that, listen, don't try this again, because this is what will happen. This is what they've done. It's quite interesting to note as an aside is that the US Open is still not going to allow people who are not vaccinated to be playing in their tournament, which means Djokovic may not play there again, and we'll be back into that discussion about vaccination. Yeah. And you think that if there was a Republican government, they would say, no, it's absolutely fine. He doesn't have to be vaccinated. He can come in. He'll get a special rapid entry through immigration. But it's tragic. But so often we hang nationalism, countries, and things like that onto what are basically athletic performances on the field in their time and space. This is not like Russia and USA is playing in a World Cup at that time. So it can get really, really ugly. But every time these kind of England and Germany plays in football, and they are partners in Euro, and still all that rubbish sort of used to just get churned out by us, by the sporting press.
Our kind,
yeah, exactly. So I think that countries will try and make these stance, or other political establishments of countries will try and make stances like this. But tennis is the world's biggest individual sport. As in, I'm not talking about golf, but as in played by people in a vast number of countries, men and women. So in that sense, it is the world's #1 individual sport. It's a global sport in bigger ways. And for the players to take a stance there was very important. And golf is, of course, doing something else altogether.
Completely different conversation.
That's for another day. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much. And just a reminder, of course, that the French Open, which is the next major to follow immediately after Wimbledon, and the US Open, which is around late August, September, both will not have any such ban on Russian athletes. in place. So that again poses questions about what the thought process was behind Wimbledon's. Of course, they're saying they're only following the government guidelines, and you know, they have no sort of autonomous decision making in this whole process. But thanks so much for taking out the time, Sharda. Wishing you a good, speedy recovery, and it's always fun talking sport with you. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. From Sharda, myself, and the entire People's Dispatch team, thanks very much for watching. As always, you can get more details on all of these stories, plus the rest of the work we do, on our website, peoplesdispatch.org. And do give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.